Wilson.
Kia ora tātou. It's great to be able to join you at your virtual conference, and congratulations on managing to get this running under such difficult conditions. So what I want to talk to you about today is a case study that I've been developing of the New Zealand government's approach to the pandemic. It became apparent to me really kind of mid to late February that the way our government was starting to think about and try to manage the pandemic was different than we were seeing in some other countries. And so I started looking to try to understand what were the particular leadership practices that they were using. And from that, over the last few weeks, I've developed essentially a model of effective leadership in a pandemic context, which I hope has got some transferable learnings, not only for other jurisdictions in terms of political heads of state, but also for people in organisations who are trying to grapple in their own spheres of influence with the challenges that the pandemic poses to us. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is step you through the different elements of my model. I've got at the end a link to where it's just recently been published in the journal Leadership, and thankfully the publisher Sage has made it open access for a few months, so please do feel free to share these ideas if you think they would be helpful to others. By focusing on leadership practices, my intention was to try to look for what was transferable learnings rather than just specifically focus on, if you like, the individual character of our Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. And I also wanted to look for ways to try to identify what was going on that wasn't just, if you like, an attribute of her personality, but were practices others could pick up on. So in that sense, while I think there have been very many good practices, I'm not necessarily trying to offer here a political analysis of the situation. I'm trying to look at it through the lens of what constitutes good leadership, if you like, in the broader context of a pandemic. And you know, had we seen these kinds of practices from a national-led government, I would be just as impressed as I am with what I've seen from a Labour-led government. In offering this analysis as well, I'm not suggesting for a moment that everything has been done perfectly or is being done perfectly. That sort of expectation is impossible to achieve anyway. And I'm not even going so far as to say that these are best practices, because I think it's far too soon to know, and I haven't done a large-scale multinational comparison yet. But what I do think is that there's pretty clear evidence here of a range of practices which have worked well in the New Zealand context, and which I think have some potential transferability into other settings. So next slide, please. And what I'm going to start doing is talking you through the different elements of the framework. So one of the key things that has struck me is that the New Zealand government has developed and fostered a shared sense of overall purpose to guide its leadership efforts and to guide the nation in response to the pandemic. And these are my words about minimising harm to lives and livelihoods. They've got their own particular branding, but it has been very much oriented around understanding that there are very tight interconnections between both the health response and the economic response, and trying to understand that both of those things are dependent on each other is something that seems to be a hallmark of countries that are doing better generally in managing the pandemic, rather than seeing that that there is, if you like, there are two different things that could be pursued, and we could only have one and not the other. So Trump, for example, has clearly prioritised the economic impacts over the health impacts, and advocated early reopening of business at the point that the disease is still not under control. So in that sense, he's prioritising minimising harm to livelihoods, whereas in the New Zealand government, they've sought to place a strong emphasis on both of those things throughout, and I think that's provided a strategic frame for thinking about the range of policy decisions that they've then made. It's also helped provide, I feel like, common ground for people to understand that there are those connections there, and that in addressing the health response, we are also setting ourselves up to be in a better place to address the economic response. So this, if you like, has been the overarching kind of north that the government has been trying to direct us towards. So next slide, please. So within that overarching purpose that leadership has pursued in this case, there have been 3 clusters of leadership practices that I've identified. The first being around being led by expertise, the second around mobilising collective effort, and the third around enabling people to cope. So I'm going to talk through some specific practices in each of those domains. So next slide, please. So in respect to the practice of being led by expertise, an important argument that I'm making here is that leadership is not always about leading. It also involves a willingness to follow. And in this case, the nature of the challenges posed by a pandemic for leaders require them to listen to and pay heed to those with expertise in areas that they themselves don't possess. Most importantly, obviously, the health expertise, but also expertise in relation to economic policy options, in relation to any of the other kinds of impacts that the pandemic is having, and a willingness not to simply assume that the leaders themselves know best what the answer is. So looking to follow the science, to use facts and evidence, and particularly to try and ensure that those facts and evidence are made transparent to members of the public so that they understand what are the criteria and what are the issues that we're all facing with, and generally a willingness to listen to relevant expertise. So part of what makes for effective leadership in the pandemic, as I've seen in New Zealand, is the government's willingness to itself be led by expertise. Now that doesn't mean blindly following what experts say, because often we will get competing advice from experts, and that's quite normal and to be expected, but it does mean wanting to lean into finding out what it is that experts in given areas can offer the government, reaching out, listening to that, engaging with that, putting weight on the importance of facts and evidence to help guide us through, and the value generally of science. So that's one bundle of leadership practices. Next slide, please. The second bundle is around the importance of mobilising the community as a whole to engage in practices themselves that will make a difference to resolving certainly the spread of the disease and then the economic recovery that comes afterwards. So right from early January, there are videos of the Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, and her Health Minister, David Clark, providing education to the public. This is before we had any cases in New Zealand, about basic things about what is social distancing and why does it happen, why does hand washing matter, why does it matter to try to not touch your face, briefing people about what did we understand, what was known generally about the disease at that point in time, and the kinds of things to keep ourselves safe, as well as what the government itself was doing. So trying at that point and consistently through to make sure that the community understands what its role is and what it can do, and what are the important bits of information that people need to have. A second feature is a very direct communication style in terms of delivering bad news upfront, matter of fact, not trying to couch things in euphemisms, but being very direct about the nature of the problem, the nature of the risks, and what needs to be done about it. So when our government announced that New Zealand was going into a lockdown, the Prime Minister specifically said, if we don't do this, tens of thousands of New Zealanders will die. Okay? So there's there's no kind of attempt to minimise the nature of the problem or to pretend that things were other than very, very serious. And that's really helps mobilise people to understand we've got a problem here. However, what particularly Ardern is skillful about is in her own communication, blending both a clear sense of direction of what she's asking people to do and what the government itself is doing, why those things matter, but also delivering that in an empathetic fashion so that people understand that the government gets that what is going on is very distressing and challenging for all of us. So at the point that she's announcing the lockdown, for example, she says you must stay at home. So there's the direction, you must stay at home for at least the next 4 weeks. But she then follows that by saying doing so will save lives. So she's giving a meaning and purpose to this direction. And then she then goes on to talk about, I understand how difficult this will be, that there is a lot that you're going to sacrifice. You know, time with families, the ability to just move about, dealing with cooped up kids. So there's a clear sense of empathetic connection with the people that she's communicating with of what does this mean for you? What she's trying to convey to us is I get that. I can care about that, I am concerned about that. And that also helps mobilise people's support because they feel heard, they feel their needs are being understood. Uniting people is an especially important aspect of effective pandemic leadership because everyone who doesn't, if you like, follow the rules in terms of managing social distancing allows chains of transmission to sustain themselves. So by everyone being united and breaking those chains of transmission or doing whatever it is, any other practices that are required to try and halt the spread of the disease, unity becomes incredibly important. And in New Zealand, the government's branding overall has been unite against COVID-19. So trying to really make it clear to people everyone has a role to play in that. More recently, Ardern has talked about New Zealand as a team of 5 million that has contributed to the very good results that we're now seeing, certainly in terms of the health response. Another way to help mobilise collective effort is to actually address the real practicalities of what is being asked of people so that they understand what to do. So in that sense, not being remote or removed as a leader and kind of floating up here in the strategic stratosphere, but actually getting down, getting directly involved in what are all the practical things that need to be addressed to help people continue their lives as best as possible. Obviously, a situation like a pandemic raises many questions and concerns from many different sources. And not every decision, of course, has been perfect, and not every decision is liked or accepted by people. However, what has been noticeable, I think, particularly in press conferences that have been almost a daily event since just before lockdown, is the very non-defensive approach taken by Ardern, taken by other key ministers, taken by the Director General Health, Ashley Bloomfield, or his deputy, in dealing with questions from the media and dealing with questions from the public, not getting defensive, so actually remaining open, remaining interested, following up on questions, generally treating that the concerns that people are raising are valid and important to them and deserve to be listened to and thought about. And actively soliciting feedback. So Ardern has used Facebook Live sessions as a particular way, I think, to solicit direct feedback, not mediated by a minder, not mediated by the press gallery, but to hear directly from people what is it that is of concern to them. And that has again provided, I think, the government with a really intuitive way of kind of sensing how is this landing for people? What is it that people are struggling with that we need to pay more attention to? What is it in terms of our actions and our messages that is landing well? Next slide, please. Final kind of bundle of practices has been around helping people to cope. So this is obviously an extremely disruptive and distressing situation that we've all found ourselves in, and both, if you like, emotionally, physically, economically, there's a lot of stress being generated for people as a result of this. So to try and help respond people to cope with this, there's a range of practices our government has engaged in. So one key practice is their alert level framework to help planning. So next slide, please. I've just got an image of this in case you're not aware of it. So the government issued this several days before lockdown, and this is, if you like, its overarching policy framework in terms of the level of restrictions. The framework itself has continued to develop and evolve, but the language of, okay, today we're in level 2, tomorrow we're moving to level 3, and level 4 is lockdown and we're there for 4 weeks. We'll tell you after 3 weeks how we're going and whether or not we think we're going to review it. All of this has helped people plan by understanding where we are at in terms of the level of restriction, what does that mean for how businesses and families and lives can operate, and signalling when those alert levels are up for review. So this has been a key tool that the government has developed to help people plan. Next slide, please. There's also been a considerable effort to build knowledge and skills to help people cope with the pandemic. So something specifically, again, that Ardern has done is that she herself has interviewed a number of experts. So she's interviewed business people, she's interviewed a psychologist, she's interviewed an educator, trying to ask essentially questions that she thinks members of the public or the business community or the education community might benefit from hearing from the expert that she is talking to try and help build people's knowledge and skills and share good practices. More broadly, there's been a really strong effort in the government's communications to help people make sense of things. So obviously the alert level framework is one key tool that helps with that, but another key concept that Ardern developed is this notion of a bubble. So when we were placed into lockdown, essentially we were told to stay within our household, and that was our bubble of the people that we could have direct contact with. And we should only interact with people in our bubble and not, if you like, break other people's bubbles. Essentially, it's a way of communicating the science of how transmission happens in a way that even small children can easily grasp. And there's been a number of examples that they have used to help people make sense. So when New Zealand started easing restrictions, and people are asking questions, and they're still asking questions today about should we be coming down faster? And these are obviously legitimate questions to ask in a democracy. But Ardern has talked about how coming down Everest is always more difficult than going up. Again, a way to help people make sense of why is the government being very cautious about easing restrictions when our case numbers are so low. Enabling kindness has been a particular feature as well that's been emphasised in the government's COVID website. There are resources around that. It's something that Ardern has repeatedly emphasised in her managing. It's something that a number of New Zealand businesses have picked up in their own marketing to try and, again, recognise this is a really stressful situation, so a bit of kindness would really make a difference. And a willingness also to, finally, the final practice is around developing creative responses to the problems that the pandemic poses. So the government initiated a wage subsidy very early on, even well before lockdown, but essentially at the point that we stopped the free flow of tourists coming into our economy. And government businesses could apply for this essentially with a one-page form. And to date, the government has dished out over $10 billion essentially on the back of a one-page form. That's a really creative response. If you've ever worked in government, you know that nothing happens on a one-page form. But it was what was deemed necessary to try and help cushion the economic impact. Another really creative response was during the lockdown. The government produced a whole series of learning resources that it sent out to homes. It's set up 2 television channels for home TV, for homeschooling children. Again, these are kind of absolutely out-of-the-box innovations that have been developed to try and help cope with the distress and the challenges for this. Next slide, please. So putting my framework all together then, overall purpose, fostering a shared purpose around minimising harm to lives and livelihoods, being led by expertise, mobilising collective effort, enabling coping, and all of this helps build trust in leadership. And the reason that matters is if people trust their leaders, they will do what is asked of them. They will actively contribute to the pursuit of the common cause, based on the belief that the leaders are acting in the best interests of the community. Okay? And if you contrast that with some other countries where it's quite clear that trust in government started off low and has got worse, and you see how much difficulty those countries are having in maintaining community compliance, you can see that the stuff really makes a difference. So how has New Zealand fared? Well, this graph here on the left from Financial Times, you'll see that New Zealand is that bottom blue line. So we moved up very quickly, but we also moved down very quickly, reflecting the fact of decisive action to move into lockdown, but also the very high level of compliance that the government achieved, not through enforcement, but through people accepting that this was the right thing to do. So buying into that shared purpose. In terms of how we're standing in terms of the losses that we've suffered, so New Zealand's death rate per million, it's a horrible thing to have to talk about, but is remarkably low. Australia's is slightly better, and I've provided in the final slide some commentary from an Australian epidemiologist as to why that might be. But you can see that compared to some other developed countries, New Zealand has fared extremely well in terms of the health response, and appears to be on the verge, essentially, of having no domestic restrictions and only border restrictions, which is well in advance of other countries. And overall, our period in lockdown has been shorter than many other countries. We've also had amongst the toughest measures in the world. So this picture on the left here, you'll see hopefully that New Zealand is the darkest of purple, to indicate that the level of restrictions that we were placed under was extremely onerous, but there was nonetheless high level of compliance. And in terms of people's willingness to accept this, a Colmar Brunton poll conducted in early April showed close to 90% of New Zealanders trusted the government was making the right decision, compared to the average in the G7 of 59%. So that is a huge margin of difference in the intangible value of trust. And I think this is particularly notable because at this time, 42% of New Zealanders were already saying their income had been personally affected, compared to only 29% in the G7. So more New Zealanders were actually feeling it in their back pocket. And also close to 2/3 of New Zealanders thought that it's going to take more than 6 months for life to return to normal, versus only 37% in the G7. So we were more impacted financially, more pessimistic about how long it was going to take to recover, but despite that, our trust in the government was a magnitude level higher. And that, I think, is a reflection of the highly effective mobilisation, the use of being led by expertise, and all the effort that's gone into enable coping. Next slide, please. So there's the framework overall, and then next slide. If you want to read the full paper, that's the link to it there, and this is just the link to the discussion about why is Australia's death rate appear to be lower than New Zealand. So if we can just go back to the framework slide, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks so much, Suze. There's a couple of questions that have come in. The first is, what are your plans for an international comparison? Have you decided which countries? And is the US too different to use as a comparison? Hi, Suze, can you hear me?
I can now.
Okay. The question was, what are your plans for an international comparison? Have you decided the countries, and is the US too different?
So yes, I started to work actually with a colleague in Tasmania, and we're going to, our primary focus is going to be countries led by women, where we can access English language speeches. And we're going to compare that with a sample of countries led by leaders who are essentially, if you like, hyper macho in their style. So Trump, Bolsonaro, Boris Johnson. So those, if you like, who are displaying a kind of a really traditional macho style, and we want to look at the different leadership practices in terms of key speeches by those leaders, and we're also going to compare, if you like, health outcomes in those countries. So we will have, thankfully, Merkel is another federal society that we can compare with, so we will have some federal states in that mix.
Okay, thank you. And the last question is, how do you suggest that we work with leaders and organisations to avoid defensiveness?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think part of it is we have to help people in leadership roles get comfortable with the fact that the role itself is ambiguous and uncertain and anxiety inducing, and learning how to cope personally with that. So in some sense that they learn to de-escalate the inclination towards defensiveness within themselves by just, if you like, by self-talk, saying the nature of the role is that people are going to challenge me and I need to not be defensive and take that personally. That's the nature of the role, and if I'm not up for those demands, then I shouldn't be in this role. So I think trying to help them learn some internal coping mechanisms to understand the nature of the role is you cannot have all the answers all the time. You cannot be right all the time. People are always going to disagree with you, even if you've done a really good job. Just live with that. That's the price, you know, that you pay for the, if you like, the perk of being in a leadership role. So yeah, that would be a suggestion.